I need to describe my sister-in-law for you. She stands about 5 feet 6 inches tall with shoulder-length blonde hair with highlights. She has incredibly pouty full lips, blue eyes, and a large bosom, and a nice rear. She's not model beauty, but she definitely has a girl next door good looks. At only 27, the best thing about her is that she has no idea how hot she can be, but she knows she's a woman and knows how to use her assets to her benefit too. Also, interesting to note, our flirtations had grown over the past several years. She had become a more permanent fixture around our house, which was fine with me. She'd come over and even stay a few days, help watch the kids, and was generally pretty helpful around the house. Every once in a dot while we flirt, but it was mainly pretty innocent. We occasionally touch each other playfully. We'd share a blanket watching a movie, and it was basically pretty harmless. For the past few months, though, I noticed that her hand would linger a little longer than necessary at times. I'd brush it off to her not having a boyfriend and needed a man's touch from time to time. She had also made a point of giving me longer than normal hugs. I loved feeling her big bosom press against my chest. From time to time, I'd even let my hand drift a bit over her body when I hugged her to let her know that I didn't mind her advances. Again, pretty innocent stuff, and my wife was none the wiser of our harmless flirtations. Recently, she has been complaining about her job and the workload. She came tired and sat down exhausted on the couch. She was rubbing her shoulders as if she was in pain. Then a series of events began to unfold. "Richard, would you rub my shoulders and back?" she asked. This was not a complete surprise, as I had rubbed her back and shoulders before, and was no big deal. This was one of the only times that I'd rubbed her back with no one around though. Most of the time, there were kids running through the room or my wife was sitting nearby. So it was nothing out of the ordinary for her to ask me if I'd rub her shoulders. So I agreed and assumed her regular position of sitting down on the floor in front of me while I stayed seated on the couch. I had to scoot up a bit to get better leverage, and she took the opportunity to lean back as my hands went to work on her neck and shoulders. "You have such strong hand, Richard." "Thank you. This feels wonderful," she stated as my hands quickly found a few knots in her shoulders. I'd start very softly kneading them, and then increase the pressure slightly every few strokes. "Oh, so good," she exclaimed in a breathless tone. The warmth of her skin felt good to my hands. I didn't want to push things too far too quickly, so I took my time. We both sort of watched a show on the TV, and I looked out our big bay window and noticed that snow had begun to fall. "It's snowing," I said. Linda seemed to not pay any attention, but let out a small aha as she closed her eyes as I increased the pressure slightly, working on a particularly tight area of her back. As I worked on the knot with one hand, my other hand began to rub up and down her back. Gently at first, and gradually pressed my palm more firmly up and down her back. Gently at first, and gradually pressed my palm more firmly up and down her back. I noticed that her shirt seemed very tight to my touch, and I couldn't help but fantasize about finally being able to take it off. But I wasn't sure that was what Linda had in mind. All of our innocent flirtations were probably lost on her. Or were they? I looked outside again and noticed that the snow was getting more intense and began covering the driveway and streets more quickly than I had seen in a few years. I felt Linda lean back into me more intentional, as if she wanted to feel me more and maybe even coax it to a higher state of arousal. She was resting her elbows and hands on my knees. She gently ran her hand down the sides of my legs. Linda moaned very lightly, as I knew that I had found her pressure point. My left hand returned to rubbing up and down her back with long strokes. My other hand joined in, and she leaned forward to grant my full access to her back. When she did, her shirt rose up a bit, exposing her delicate skin to me. My body began to wake up again with this sight, and for a moment I became awed as my mind raced to think of all the things I wanted to do with my sister-in-law. She seemed so innocent, yet looked so hot, and basically she was giving me the green light to take it further. "I'll play it slowly, just to be safe," I continued with long strokes up and down the left and right of her spine. From her shoulder blades to the top of her jeans, I allowed my fingers to gently linger and brush between the waistband of her underwear, skin in folds. It sent shivers down her spine, and she jolted against me, which caused my member to grow even more. She held herself there for a few moments. She then kissed me very hard and literally shoved her tongue down my throat. My hands continued roaming her body. She began to grind her hips against me. I felt my member nuzzle against her body as she sat back and wickedly grinned at me and bit her lip as her hips continued their gyrations. I held her close to me, relishing in this beautiful and nubile younger woman who wanted me so badly. She then slipped out of my embrace back down to her knees on the floor and shot me another wicked look as her hand quickly found my bulge. She yanked at the sides of my shorts. I responded by lifting my hips to allow her to force them down and quickie off. My member sprang forth, nearly slapping her in the face. She giggled loudly as she wrapped her hand around it, and I was proud of the way it looked in her smaller hand as it made it look much bigger than it really is. I was so hard by then I almost lost it as soon as she touched me. Electricity pulsed through my body, but somehow managed to control myself as she admired my weighty member in her hand. "Well," she exclaimed, "what do we have here?" She giggled and looked me straight in the eyes as she moved forward and stuck the tip in her mouth and swirled her tongue around it and back out again. She extended her tongue out as she wrapped her hand around its girth and smacked it 3 times against her tongue as if she was sizing it up for what was next. A small globule of saliva strung from her tongue to the base of my head. She held it out and with one amazing movement slid, almost half inside her mouth. I could feel my head pulsing as her tongue began swirling around, expertly handling the head. "Yes," is all I could manage as her tongue began to glide up and down the length of my member. The feeling was phenomenal. She then took the entire length inside her mouth and continued her glorious assault. She looked up at me as my hand moved to the back of her head. I could tell she was straining to take all of me, but I held her in place for a second longer. I released her as she let out a husky groan. "Yes! Oh God, that is so good! Do it again," she pleaded as I grabbed the back of her head again and guided her wide open mouth towards my now glistening member. She released her hands and held them behind her back, allowing me to control the pace. Her eyes locked on mine. I slowly slid inside her waiting mouth. Her tongue guided along the underside of my member. She expertly allowed herself to take me fully inside her mouth and down her throat. I moved my hips forward, making her take even more quickie than she had anticipated. She looked up with every innocent eyes as I released her. For a second I thought I might be hurting her, but she quickly collected herself to say, "Oh, I love the feeling of your member filling my mouth," is all she could muster. She then gathered her ample mounds and jiggled them a few shakes before spitting between them and wrapped them around my member. She laughed as she began to play with her mounds and began to move forward and backward on my member. The feeling of her warm skin as my member disappeared in and out of her mounds was heavenly. It created a wonderful friction, and every once in a while Linda would allow the tip of my member to brush the tip of her tongue. As my eyes continued locked on her, she sensed that I was close to my destination. I could feel it beginning to well up inside of me, and she urged me on. "Yes, Richard, do it for me. I need it," she said as I couldn't hold it. I stroked her hair back behind her ears, and I smiled at her. "I've wanted you for a long time, you know," as I moved to her cheek and brushed it and pulled her up to me and held her closely. "Yes, I knew, and I've wanted you for a long time too. I'm glad we're able to have this time together."